in our country last week, of course, in the last 2 weeks, we've been having a very public discussion again after the shooting in Uvalde, Texas. It was senseless, made no sense. Grief that was palpable. The people in that community, we talked with reporters there, and they said it was just like a pall hanging over. And you can understand that. How long will these people grieve? For the rest of their lives intensely? Or will it abate with time? Well, that's a good question. And when it doesn't go away and that grief becomes all-consuming, is that problematic for the person involved in terms of their mental health and state of mental health? Well, let's talk about it this morning with the good doctor, Dr. John Braccio with Regional Psychological Services of East Lansing, and Dr. John B, letter B.com for the podcast. Good morning, sir. Welcome.
Well, good morning to you, Dave, and welcome to you also to talk to you. I always love talking to you, particularly on important topics, and I believe this is one of them. And in terms of the question, there's really no easy answer in terms of when people are going to get over grieving.
Well,
and I think
And Doc, I want to make sure that people clearly understand what we're talking about here, because everybody goes through periods of grief in their life. But for some people, that grief doesn't go away and it digs in. And that's what we're discussing today, right? When it goes.
That's right.
Okay.
And I think people are more tuned in to circumstances right now. I think the killing of the 19 children, the 2 teachers in Uvalde, Texas, and other senseless killings, along with 1 million deaths from COVID.
Right.
We've seen a lot of deaths, just an unusual amount, and with people who have been locked up, tied up, call it what you will, in terms of emotionally in homes. It's been a difficult time where people weren't even able to be with their loved ones in the case of COVID, when many of them were dying. So it's been a tough thing. So I think millions of us have been tuned in to this grieving process. The difference is our grieving over time will end. This doesn't really always happen for family and close friends of persons who for whatever the reason, they've lost their loved ones. And I think to be killed by a psychopath, predictably would lead to the most intense grieving. However, the length of time a person grieves really totally depends on the person, Dave. It's been often said wrongly that grieving that lasts more than a year is a psychological condition. This is absurd and even very insensitive to the person grieving. I'll give you a personal example. My parents never fully got over the death of my 2-year-old brother who died in 1943 from childhood meningitis. That's one of those things that, you always, meaning they moved on in life, but we always knew there were memories in the home of him, and he was discussed, like he was a person. But it's prolonged grief disorder. This is something very fortunate, in my opinion. DSM V, which is what we use for diagnosis in mental health, has now officially come up with this diagnosis of the, prolonged grief disorder. And it's for persons that are suffering these characteristics, and I'll just talk about these briefly, for more than a year, because there's no one way to grieve, okay? And just one, the belief, disbelief it could have happened. 2, intense longing for the person. 3, identity confusion, where the person feels not whole without the deceased person. 4, even avoiding reminders of the deceased person. 5, emotional numbness. 6, intense loneliness. 7, feeling like life is meaningless. 8, no desire to meaningfully interact with people or with life. 9, intense despair. And the intensity of these feelings don't subside. That's what makes this condition so difficult for people and not understood by others, because it can stay in force, the intensity, for years, because the person with prolonged grief needs sensitivity and patience from friends and family. And additionally, if you get to the point where it can't be worked and there are persons that can't, then a combination of clergy or trained therapists with grieving expertise can be helpful. But Dave, this is a very, very difficult situation for someone to have. And we do live in a society where people say, golly, it's been a year and a half. The person has to move on. It's just not that simple. When a person is that deeply embedded emotionally, physically, both with a person, and that person is gone, and it's someone that you really loved and cared for, whether it's a child, a spouse, a dear friend, it can be very, very difficult. So at least recognizing this as a condition and something that does go on. It's one of those things. You might not have a huge percentage, but you do have a large number of people that have trouble getting over grieving.
Doc, do you, though, yourself, I mean, you mentioned the 1 year kind of somewhat of it's like you're paying your taxes, like an arbitrary time frame, a year and a day. Do you feel, though, that maybe this disorder gets placed too soon on people? If indeed everybody grieves at a different pace, that some may eventually shed their grief, but it may not be tied to 365 days, if you see where I'm going with that.
Well, I do. I agree with you, and that's why it's different. Some people can linger on, and some never really get over it. Someone loses a child, and particularly an only child, it's even worse. And you never quite can get over that. And you always wonder, what might you have done? Like, the child had died with a relative. Okay, if you had even been there and missed something that was going on, this type. These are hard things. Another thing, too, people can go through a period of time, not just to talk about personal things, but when my father had died in 82, my mother seemed stoic. Everything seemed quite calm. Relatively, obviously she was grieving, but a year later she called me crying and says, 2 of everything and 1 of me. And we moved her to Lansing, and she stayed here a few years before she returned back to Grand Rapids and lived right next door to my sister. But it's one of those things about grieving. It's one of those things that you really never, you never quite maybe get over something, but it's a level of how do you get over it. If the feelings are just as intense a year, 2 years, 3 years later, then that is what is prolonged grief disorder. And I think that's when people need to be sensitive. They don't need to say it's time to move on. Or a lot of times people will just say, I'm doing okay, because they don't want to run into this, aren't you over this yet? Even though people want to be good, want to be sensitive, they just
say the wrong things about it. Yeah.
And they have trouble. They can't comprehend it because they think a person ought to be able to move on. And boy, it just doesn't work that way. If you have a deeply loved person, someone, it's hard to move on and forget, particularly if you were together many, many years. But every situation is different. Like I say, I've run into it various times, many times even. And there's not a set one. It could be for a child. It can be for a dear friend. It can be for a parent. It can be for just whatever. It's whoever the person really was enormously attached to emotionally, and the idea of living a life without them. Some people can be helped spiritually. Others can be helped by talking about it. Others need to just get these feelings out.
And I think about how children react here too. And when I was young, and my grandfather died, I was very close with my grandfather. Okay, but I had a couple of cousins who lived a couple thousand miles away, and they weren't. And when one would say, they're there for the funeral, well, it's for the best. He's in a better place. I lashed out. I'm like, you're not. My grief is different than your level of grief right now, and I mean, it was lashing out. This can it manifest in children differently than adults here, and be something that with the loss of a parent, etc., where we talked about losing a child, but with a young person, can this manifest as well?
Absolutely, Dave. I mean, if a person has a great relationship, an important relationship with a grandparent, with a parent, with a brother, sure, and it can carry on for years, and can even impact the person even later. I mean, it's not unusual to hear a child say that the most important person, and it could have been a grandparent or a parent, died early on, and they never really developed the type of relationship that they would have if they had a father, if it had been a mother, or another brother or sister. See, the thing about this, you can't just use logic with it, because it totally depends on the person. Some people get over things quicker. It doesn't mean they're less sensitive or less caring. They just are able to move on, and others just they really can't get on. We see a lot of this, I think, with spouses tend to be the one that's we see the most, that a person even years later just cannot get over the death of a spouse or with a child. But it could be the connections don't even have to be quite that close. when you see people or you talk to people like I do that just say, I just can't get over the image of this person dying or this person not being here or my not having been there or I was there. It's just unfair. It's horrible. Even with a spiritual belief, why did this happen? Even if they believe they will see them in the future, the living in the present is very, very difficult. Very, very difficult situation. And I think the one thing about the COVID, which made it so horrible, there were people that were dying and no one could touch them, no one could be near them.
Oh, absolutely. No, it's probably the worst, not just the loss, but the inability to have any kind of what we would say proper closure. I don't know if that's the right phrase, but
that is sure.
And that was denied, and I think that we're still dealing with the repercussions from that.
Oh my goodness,
and
are we ever?
Yeah, and we absolutely are. Prolonged grief disorder. It's a real thing. It's now a recognized disorder, and for some people, it's a pretty debilitating thing. The good doctor discussing it today. This will be on the podcast very shortly, as all of them always are, and you can always contact Regional Psychological Services in East Lansing, Michigan, headed up by Dr. John Braccio here, and with his son as well. Always good to talk to you, Doc. I wish you well, and we'll chat again shortly, okay?
Same to you. Talk to you shortly, buddy.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right. We'll be back in a moment on the Morning Wake Up. It's 1320 WILS.